I've been involved in the field of service learning for almost 20 years, going back to the late 1980s. But there's a pattern that I've noticed in the field that I just want to put on the table, and that is that we have this really strong tendency to focus on the learning dimension of service learning, to talk about how it's valuable academic learning, that it's rigorous academic learning. We need to focus on that dimension of service learning, that learning dimension, because otherwise people are going to say, oh, that's just that sort of feel-good, touchy-feely, it's sort of superficial kind of stuff. So we got to show people that it's really solid learning. But there's this sort of working assumption that seems to go on that we all agree on what service means. We hardly ever talk about what that part of the equation means. And yet, I find that when we go below the surface, we have some really different points of view, and sometimes even contradictory points of view. And so what I'd like to do is break open that conversation a little bit. And I want to begin by asking you, what do you mean by service? How would you define it in like one sentence? What's a one-sentence definition of service? Now that you've thought about your definition, I want to offer you one that I often hear. Service is doing something for or giving something to a person or group in need. Now, when I've done this in workshops and I've put that definition up, I've occasionally gotten somebody to turn to the person they were doing their one-sentence definition with and go, I nailed it, I got it. In which case I would say, I'm not so sure you did, because I'm not sure that's really that good a definition of service. And the reason I say that is I can think of examples that fit the definition, but aren't what we think of when we think of what service really means. I'll start with an example that happened to a colleague of mine who was collecting food for a food drive in his homeroom one day in school. And the students had signed up to bring in different food items. Some were bringing in cranberries, some were bringing in rolls, some were bringing in potatoes, so not everybody was bringing in the same thing. And he got to one young man who held out a bag of croutons. And the problem was that croutons weren't on the list. And so he looks at the list, he looks at the student, he said, you signed up to bring in stuffing, and those are croutons. And the student looked him right in the eye, and as he dropped the bag into the box, said, my mom says beggars can't be choosers. Now, you could argue that he gave something that could actually, I suppose, be used to make some kind of stuffing. It's going to a person or group in need, but that's not service. If it's not service, what's missing from the definition? Second story. In my community, if you're a person who needs a meal free because you can't afford food, during the middle of the day, during the lunch hour, you can get it at the Salvation Army Monday through Friday, but on the weekends you're going to have to rely on one of the local churches that run what we call community meals. And one young man, an 8th grader, had decided for a service project to work at the community meal in his church community. And he came in the following Monday, told his teacher he had done that, and the teacher thought, oh great, I want the rest of the kids in the class to know what he learned. So he asks the young man to stand up at the front of the room and tell a story about what was this like. And so the young man begins, I started, got there at about 10 o'clock, I started making the food, and then we put it out in the tables there, the warming bins, and I was spooning corn onto people's plates, and they were coming through and they were saying thank you, and I felt really good about what I was doing until this fat lady came in with 3 little kids. Golly, were obnoxious. She must have been a single parent. And when they came through that line, not a single one of them said thank you. And then when they sat down, I saw her pull a cell phone out of her purse. No wonder she's poor. And the teacher who told me the story later looked up at him and thought, oh my goodness, I wasn't thinking that they were going to talk like that. That wasn't the lesson that the teacher had thought the student had learned. Fortunately, there was another young man in the class, these were 8th graders, who raised his hand and said, excuse me, but if your family were homeless tonight and they had to be out of the shelter, because you can't be in the shelter during the day, And they didn't have work. Now, granted, a lot of homeless folks work, but they didn't have a job and they had applied for one. How would they know that they were being called in for an interview if they didn't have the cell phone? And the teacher who told me this story said you could just see the wheels turning in that kid's head as he thought about the stereotypes and prejudices and attitudes that his story had revealed about what was going on inside him. He did something for a person in need. For all they know, he didn't have that going on inside. He may not have communicated it, although we tend to, I think. But what he did wasn't service as we think about it. So what's missing from the definition? What does that story illustrate needs to also be there? Third story, Peggy, 21-year-old, working in a mentoring program, tutoring program in inner city Cincinnati, sits down with Belinda, 10 years old, starts to tutor her in math. In her journal afterwards, she describes the situation. She said, I was really feeling good about what I was doing. I was making a difference in a child's life. I was excited about doing this. I mean, she wasn't really proud in a negative sense. She just felt good. It lasted for about 10 minutes, she said, and then Belinda reached back with all her might and kicked me in the shins. And that kick woke me up because she had a whole lot more to teach me than I had to teach her. So, who's the person in need in that story? Fourth story. There was a teacher who promoted a food drive in her classroom. And she described about how important it was to be aware of people beyond ourselves. And we need to help those people that are poor in our community. We need to help them out. We're going to collect food and we're going to make sure it goes to them. She came back the next day and found a note under her door, anonymous, typed, from a student who said, I'm sorry that I can't bring anything into the food drive because my family is going to be one of the recipients and there's nothing in our cupboards. I'm one of them. But I guess there's nothing I can do to contribute to the food drive. So maybe I don't belong in that activity. Is service only about if I have stuff or I have resources, giving it? I mean, what about those of us who are experiencing the injustice that's being addressed? What role do we play? Are we just helpless receivers? Do we have assets and dreams and energy to offer? Can we even be leaders? How do we say that in that definition? Final story. Pam's a friend of mine, and she's been in the field of service learning for a while. Several years ago, she told me, Kevin, I'm surveying college students around service learning around the country, and I'm finding this really disturbing pattern. A lot of students are writing something or saying something that sounds like this. Wow, working at the homeless shelter, life-changing, opens me up to a whole part of reality that I hadn't seen before, people I've never met. It's enriched me so much. I hope my kids have the same opportunity to do this when they're my age. And Pam looked at me and she said, it reminds me of the phrase that Paulo Freire, the Brazilian popular educator, used. Poor people weren't put on this planet to be the object of our service. And then Pam said, when your kids are your age, there shouldn't be any homelessness. Is the work that we're doing only about perpetuating the way things are? Or is it about contributing to the process of transformation of a society in which oppression and injustice and that kind of desperate need no longer exists? How do we say that in the definition?